All right, let's dive into this. You sent over The Negro Family, The Case for National Action. It's a pretty hefty document published back in March 1965 by the U.S. Department of Labor.
Oh, I
You've
love
got
that.
excerpts, quotes, and stats from the report itself to work with. Today's deep dive is all about this report, unpacking its key findings and understanding what they mean in a larger historical context
Okay.
for those unfamiliar. This landmark document landed right in the heart of the Civil Rights era, a time of immense social change and upheaval.
What's fascinating is this report was published just a year after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, at a moment when the nation was grappling with the question, what comes next?
Exactly. You've got President Lyndon B. Johnson talking about unity and the American dream. But this report throws a curveball, highlighting a looming crisis in race relations. It argues that despite the progress made, things are actually getting worse for many Black Americans, particularly in terms of family structure.
And that's where the report zeroes in, on what it saw as the most crucial issue, the deterioration of the Black family structure. It goes beyond just saying poverty is bad and argues that there's a fundamental shift happening in family dynamics within Black communities.
I'm struck by the data the report presents. It highlights high rates of divorce, separation, and out-of-wedlock births, claiming these trends lead to female-headed households and increased reliance on welfare. The numbers are pretty stark. Almost a quarter of urban Black marriages were dissolved at the time, and nearly a quarter of Black families were headed by women. That's a huge difference compared to white families back then.
And to understand this, the report doesn't just stop at describing the problem. It digs deep, going all the way back to slavery, to explore the historical roots of this perceived crisis.
Wow.
It even compares the American system of slavery to that in Brazil, suggesting that the specific way slavery unfolded in the U.S. was particularly harmful to Black family structures.
This comparison really jumped out at me. It seems to be saying that. Denying enslaved people the right to form families in the U.S. created uniquely damaging long-term impacts that we were still seeing in 1965.
That's a key takeaway. It highlights how the intentional disruption of family ties under U.S. slavery had a profound and lasting impact. And the report goes on to argue that this disruption continued even after slavery with the emergence of Reconstruction and Jim Crow laws.
Right. It argues that those systems of segregation and discrimination, which limited economic opportunities and social mobility for Black Americans, further undermined family stability. It's a reminder of the long shadow of slavery and the way systemic racism continued to shape Black lives long after emancipation.
This brings up a really important question. How much of the situation in 1965, as the report saw it, was due to current policies, and how much was due to the lingering effects of a system that had only recently been abolished?
Then the report fast-forwards to the 20th century, highlighting the Great Migration, when millions of Black Americans moved from the rural South to the urban North. I know this was driven by hope for better opportunities and escape from Jim Crow, but the report points out that it also brought new challenges.
Exactly. While many Black families were seeking a better life, they often faced overcrowding, poverty, and continued discrimination. In these urban centers, this rapid urbanization, combined with existing racial inequalities, created a perfect storm that put even more pressure on Black family structures.
The report actually uses the term urban frontier to describe this phenomenon, which I find really interesting. It captures both the sense of opportunity and the feeling of being in unfamiliar and often hostile territory.
It's a compelling phrase. And within this urban frontier, the report argues traditional family roles were being challenged and reshaped. The urban environment, with its different social and economic realities, didn't support the patriarchal model that had been dominant in the rural South.
Right. The report highlights how Black men in the urban North often faced limited job prospects and lower wages. Compared to their white counterparts, this made it harder for them to be the primary breadwinner, leading to a shift in power dynamics within families.
But this is where the report introduces one of its most controversial ideas, the concept of a matriarchal family structure. Now, to understand this, we need to think about the context of the 1960s. The report uses this term to describe a situation where, due to various social and economic forces, Black mothers often became the primary decision makers in the family.
This idea of the matriarchal Black family has been debated and criticized ever since the report was published. But to be fair, the report doesn't frame this as a choice. It portrays it as an outcome of the historical and social forces acting on Black families.
It's true. The report doesn't say Black women want to be in this position, but it does argue that this matriarchal structure while the response to challenging circumstances ultimately has negative consequences for Black men and boys.
That's where things get tricky, right? It's saying this dynamic undermines Black men's authority and limits opportunities for children. That's definitely a perspective shaped by the gender dynamics of the 1960s.
Absolutely. And it's important to recognize how our understanding of family structures and gender roles has evolved since then. This part of the report sparked a lot of debate at the time, and it continues to be a sensitive topic today. But to understand the report fully, we need to grapple with this concept and its implications. And building on this idea of the matriarchal family structure, the report goes on to paint a rather bleak picture of the challenges facing Black communities. It uses this loaded phrase, a tangle of pathology, to describe the interconnected issues. It sees high rates of crime delinquency, school dropout, unemployment, and dependence on welfare.
Okay, let's unpack this tangle of pathology. It's a pretty strong term, right? It seems to suggest that these social ills are somehow inherent to Black communities, which is obviously a very problematic notion.
It's certainly a term that wouldn't fly today. It reflects a way of thinking about social problems that was prevalent in the 1960s. But today, we'd approach it with much more nuance, considering the role of systemic factors and historical injustices.
Right. It's crucial to remember that correlation doesn't equal causation. The report might highlight a link between certain family structures and these social issues, but it doesn't fully account for all the other forces at play, like poverty, lack of opportunity, and ongoing racial discrimination.
Absolutely. It's a complex web of factors, and we can't isolate one element and say it's the sole cause of these problems. But the report does clearly place a lot of emphasis on the family structure, viewing it as a key factor in understanding these challenges.
And it specifically connects this tangle of pathology to the instability of the Black family. It claims that children raised in single-parent homes or without strong father figures are more likely to struggle in various aspects of life.
This is another point that's been widely contested and criticized. It risks blaming Black families for the very problems that systemic racism and inequality have created. It's a classic example of what we call blaming the victim, which is something we need to be very cautious of.
It's a good point. The report does acknowledge external factors like discrimination and poverty, but its primary focus remains on the internal dynamics of the Black family. This emphasis on individual behavior and family structure rather than broader societal forces has been a major source of criticism.
But even if we critique the report's framing, it's still important to understand its argument and why it resonated with some people at the time. The report then shifts its focus to the specific challenges faced by Black youth, arguing that many of them are growing up in environments that are actively hindering their chances of success.
The report paints a pretty grim picture, talking about inadequate housing, limited educational opportunities, and even exposure to violence, and it argues that these challenges are further compounded by the breakdown of the Black family, particularly the absence of fathers. It's a lot for young people to deal with.
And it's here that the report introduces another potentially loaded term, cultural deprivation. It argues that many Black children, especially those in poverty and in urban environments, are missing the cultural capital and social skills needed to thrive in mainstream society.
This concept has been both influential and problematic. On the one hand, it's been used to argue for investing in early childhood education and social programs, which is a positive thing. But on the other hand, it's also been used to perpetuate negative stereotypes about Black culture and to ignore the strengths and resilience that exist within Black communities.
It's a delicate balance. It's important to acknowledge the real obstacles and disadvantages that many Black children face. But we have to be very careful not to reinforce harmful stereotypes or to dismiss the richness and complexity of Black culture.
Right, and we also need to avoid making sweeping generalizations about entire groups of people. It's important to remember that every individual's experience is unique, and we can't reduce complex social issues down to simple explanations.
Exactly, and the report itself goes on to present a lot of data to support its claims about the disadvantages faced by Black youth. For example, it points out that in 1960, Black men and women had completed significantly fewer years of schooling on average compared to their white counterparts.
And it goes on to explore how this educational gap then impacts employment opportunities. It highlights how Black Americans are disproportionately concentrated in low-paying, unskilled jobs while remaining underrepresented in professional and managerial roles. This is a pattern we still see today, unfortunately.
It's a persistent problem, and the report argues that these disparities in education and employment are, at least in part, a consequence of what it calls the instability of the Black family. It's suggesting a connection between family structure and economic outcomes.
But isn't that a bit of a chicken and egg situation, it seems like? The report is saying that Black families are unstable because they're poor, and they're poor because their families are unstable. It's hard to know which comes first.
It's a valid point. The report doesn't fully untangle those complex relationships between poverty, family structure, and opportunity. And it's here that we encounter another one of the most controversial aspects of the report. Its analysis of the role of Black women.
This is where things get really sensitive. The report essentially argues that the matriarchal structure, while arising from historical and social forces, is actually contributing to the cycle of poverty and disadvantage. It's a very charged argument.
It is, and it's important to approach this section with a critical eye, recognizing that the report is reflecting the gender biases of the time. It suggests that Black women, by taking on the role of head of household, are somehow undermining the authority of Black men and fostering a culture of dependency.
But wasn't this framework essentially blaming Black women for systemic problems that were completely out of their control? It seems like the report is overlooking the incredible strength and resilience Black women have shown in the face of adversity.
You're absolutely right. That's a major criticism of the report. It's an example of how focusing solely on family structure can lead to a distorted understanding of complex social issues. It's essential to recognize the systemic factors like racism and sexism that shape people's lives and limit their choices.
It seems like the report is missing a lot of nuance here. It's not taking into account the agency and the complex realities of Black women's lives.
And it's worth noting that this view of Black women as somehow responsible for the problems facing Black communities has been used to justify harmful policies and to deflect attention from the role of systemic racism. We need to be very aware of those historical implications.
So while the report might have had good intentions in highlighting the challenges facing Black families, it seems like its analysis often falls short, especially when it comes to understanding the roles of women and the impact of broader societal forces.
That's a fair assessment. The report's focus on family structure, while perhaps well-intentioned, can lead to some problematic conclusions. But even with these limitations, the report still sparked a lot of debate and had a significant impact on social policy in the years that followed.
That makes sense. It brought these issues to the forefront of national conversation, even if its analysis was flawed in some ways. So what else does the report delve into?
Well, from there, it turns its attention to crime and delinquency, presenting data showing that Black youth are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system, both as victims and perpetrators.
That's unfortunately still true today, and I imagine the report connects this back to the instability of the Black family, right?
Exactly. It argues that children raised in single-parent homes or without strong father figures are more likely to engage in criminal activity.
But again, isn't that oversimplifying a very complex issue? There's so many other factors at play when it comes to crime, like poverty, lack of opportunity, and of course, systemic racism in the criminal justice system itself.
That's a crucial point. The report's analysis here is very limited, and it risks perpetuating harmful stereotypes. We need to be extremely careful about drawing simplistic connections between family structure and complex social problems like crime.
It sounds like this section of the report needs to be read with a lot of caution, taking into account the potential biases and limitations of its perspective.
Absolutely. We can't just accept its conclusions at face value. We need to engage with them critically, considering the broader context and the evidence we have from other sources.
Okay, so crime is a big focus, but are there any other areas the report explores?
Yes, it actually takes a bit of a detour to discuss the role of the armed forces in American society. It argues that military service can provide a pathway to upward mobility and social integration, emphasizing the importance of the military for instilling discipline, responsibility, and a strong work ethic.
That's interesting. It's almost like the report is suggesting that military service could be a solution for some of the challenges facing Black youth, especially those who might be struggling in civilian life.
It does seem to imply that, but at the same time, the report also notes that Black Americans are underrepresented in the armed forces, particularly in the higher ranks and more skilled positions.
So even in an institution that's supposed to be based on merit and equal opportunity, there are still barriers facing Black Americans.
Exactly, and the report attributes this underrepresentation to a number of factors, including lower levels of education, higher rates of criminal records, and failure to pass the armed forces mental test.
And I'm guessing the report ties these factors back to the family structure again.
It suggests that the lack of structure and support in the home environment hinders Black youth from succeeding in a military environment.
But it seems like the report might be missing something crucial here. Even if there are challenges within families, there are also systemic barriers within the military itself, right? Things like discrimination, limited opportunities for advancement, and a culture that might not be welcoming to Black service members.
That's a really important point. The report does acknowledge the persistent discrimination faced by Black service members, but it doesn't fully explore how that discrimination might contribute to the underrepresentation it's highlighting.
So even in an institution that's supposed to be about equality and national unity, we still see the impact of broader societal forces like racism.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that these issues are deeply ingrained in our society, and they manifest themselves in all sorts of ways, even within institutions that are ostensibly designed to promote equality.
Okay, so we've got a deep dive into the report's analysis of family structure crime and even the military. What other areas does it touch on?
Well, the report introduces a concept it calls alienation, referring to a growing disconnect between Black men and mainstream American society. It observes that Black men are increasingly absent from the workforce, both because of unemployment and a lack of engagement with traditional avenues of success.
That's a powerful observation. It sounds like the report is trying to capture a sense of disillusionment and frustration among Black men, a feeling that their efforts aren't being rewarded and that they're being excluded from the opportunities that are available to others.
That's exactly what the report is getting at, and it attributes this alienation to a number of factors, including, of course, the matriarchal family structure, limited job opportunities, and a sense of resentment stemming from persistent racial discrimination.
It's a complex mix of personal and systemic factors, isn't it? It's not just about individual choices, but also about the barriers and prejudices that Black men face in a society that often devalues their experiences and aspirations.
Exactly. This concept of alienation has been influential in shaping discussions about Black masculinity and the challenges faced by Black men in a society that often doesn't see or value their contributions.
It's a term that helps us understand the frustration and anger that can arise when people feel like they're being constantly pushed to the margins, even when they're working hard and trying to succeed.
And the report argues that this alienation has significant consequences both for Black men themselves and for the broader Black community. It suggests that it contributes to a cycle of poverty, crime, and social instability.
It's a bleak picture, but it also seems to be a call for understanding and empathy. If we can recognize the roots of this alienation, perhaps we can start to address the underlying issues and create a more inclusive and equitable society.
I agree. It's important to see this concept not just as a description of a problem, but also as a call for change. We need to create a society where all men, regardless of their race, feel valued, respected, and empowered to reach their full potential.
So alienation is a major theme, but are there any other specific issues the report highlights?
Yes, it goes on to discuss the alarming rise of drug addiction in Black communities, particularly in urban centers. It notes that the rate of narcotic use in certain areas like central Harlem was significantly higher than the city average in the early 1960s.
That's a disturbing statistic, and I imagine the report ties us back to the social and economic problems plaguing Black communities, right?
It argues that drug addiction is both a symptom and a cause of the tangle of pathology it described earlier.
But isn't that a bit simplistic? Drug addiction is a complex issue with many contributing factors, both personal and societal. It's not simply a consequence of poverty or social instability.
You're right, the report's analysis of drug addiction is somewhat limited, and it lacks the nuanced understanding of addiction and substance abuse that we have today. It tends to view addiction primarily as a moral failing, rather than a complex public health issue with deep social and economic roots.
It's important to read this section with a critical eye, recognizing that our understanding of addiction has evolved significantly since the 1960s. We now recognize the role of genetics, trauma, mental health, and environmental factors in contributing to addiction. It's not simply a matter of personal weakness or bad choices.
Exactly. We need to approach this issue with compassion and understanding, recognizing the complexity of the problem and the need for comprehensive solutions that address both individual and societal factors.
So the report's take on drug addiction might be a bit outdated, but it's still raising an important issue that continues to affect Black communities disproportionately.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that we need to continue to invest in research, prevention, and treatment programs that address the root causes of addiction and support individuals struggling with substance abuse.
Okay, so drug addiction is another area the report explores. What else is on the list?
Well, the report concludes its exploration of the challenges facing Black communities by examining the limited progress of school integration in the North. It notes that despite legal mandates, many Black children continue to attend segregated schools, particularly in urban areas.
That's a stark reminder that legal equality doesn't automatically translate into lived equality, even with laws in place to desegregate schools. There were still so many barriers, both systemic and social, preventing Black children from having equal access to quality education.
And the report argues that this segregation perpetuates a cycle of inequality, limiting educational opportunities and social mobility for Black students.
It's a logical argument. If you're stuck in a school that's underfunded and overcrowded, you're less likely to succeed academically and less likely to have the same opportunities as students in wealthier, better resourced schools.
And it's not just about resources. Segregated schools can also reinforce racial divisions and stereotypes, limiting the opportunities for cross-cultural understanding and empathy.
It's a missed opportunity for building bridges and creating a more inclusive society.
Exactly. And the report suggests that school integration is essential for addressing the racial disparities in education and for promoting greater understanding and empathy between Black and white Americans.
It's a powerful argument for the social and moral benefits of integration. It's not just about academic achievement, but also about creating a more just and equitable society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
That's the core idea.
Yeah.
But the report also acknowledges the resistance to integration from both white and Black communities, highlighting the complex social and political dynamics at play.
It's a reminder that social change is rarely simple or straightforward. There are often deep-seated prejudices, fears, and even legitimate concerns that need to be addressed in order to move forward in a positive direction.
It's about having those difficult conversations, building trust and finding common ground, even when it's challenging. And it's about recognizing that real progress requires not just changing laws, but also changing hearts and minds. So after laying out this complex and at times very bleak picture of the challenges facing Black America, the report reaches its conclusion, a call to action.
Okay. It argues that these issues, particularly the focus on family instability, aren't just a Black problem, they're an American problem, requiring a national response.
That's a big statement. It
Yeah.
seems like the report is saying, we can't just ignore this or treat it as someone else's problem. It needs to be a shared responsibility, a collective effort to find solutions. And the report is very clear about its intentions. It states that the object of this study has been to define a problem, to set forth its dimensions, and to indicate the major directions that must be taken if it is to be solved. It's not just an academic exercise, it's a blueprint for action.
And it seems like the report places a huge emphasis on the role of the federal government. In leading this effort, it calls for federal policy directed to a new kind of national goal, specifically the establishment of a stable Negro family structure.
It's interesting how the report frames this. It's not suggesting handouts or charity. It's talking about a fundamental shift in national priorities, a recognition that the well-being of Black families is essential to the well-being of the nation as a whole.
It's almost like it's saying that America has a moral obligation to address these issues, not just for the sake of Black Americans, but for its own sake. A healthy society can't exist with such deep inequality.
And it links this directly to the idea of fulfilling the promise of American democracy. There's this powerful line. It is simply the assertion of the claims staked by the Negro American family for the first time in 200 years. It's framing this as a matter of rights and justice, not just a social problem to be solved.
So it's not just about helping people out of poverty. It's about recognizing their inherent right to a stable family life, a right to opportunity, a right to participate fully in the American dream, which has been denied for so long.
Exactly. And to achieve this, the report argues, we need a comprehensive approach. It emphasizes the need for job creation, increased wages, and expanded access to education and training, specifically for Black Americans. It's saying we can't just address symptoms. We have to address the root causes of economic inequality.
It makes sense. How can you expect families to thrive if they don't have access to decent jobs, quality education, and a fair shot at economic success? These are basic building blocks of a stable and secure life.
Right. And the report is saying that those building blocks have been systematically denied to Black Americans for generations, leading to the very problems it's describing. It's a pretty bold indictment of the status quo.
It really is. And the report doesn't mince words. When it comes to laying out the consequences of inaction, it states that America is free to choose whether the Negro shall share in her liability or become her opportunity. It's framing this as a choice, a decision point for the nation.
It's a stark choice. Continue down the path of inequality and face the consequences, or embrace a future where everyone has a chance to succeed and contribute to the nation's prosperity. It's a powerful way to end the report, leaving the reader with a sense of urgency and a challenge to act.
Looking back at this report now, it's striking how many of the issues it raises are still relevant today. We're still grappling with racial disparities in wealth, education, employment, and family structure. The report's insights into those systemic factors feel very timely, even though it was written almost 60 years ago.
It's a testament to the enduring nature of these challenges and a reminder that the fight for racial justice is a long and ongoing process. We've made progress in some areas, but there's still so much work to be done.
It's also interesting to consider how our understanding of some of these issues has evolved. The report's focus on the matriarchal family structure and its use of terms like cultural deprivation were definitely products of their time and would be viewed very differently today.
Absolutely. We have a much more nuanced understanding of family structures, gender roles, and the impact of systemic racism. It's important to read the report through that critical lens, recognizing both its insights and its limitations.
But even with those limitations, the report had a significant impact. It helped to shape the conversation about race and poverty in America, and it contributed to the development of social programs aimed at addressing these issues.
It's a complicated legacy. It raised important questions, but it also perpetuated some harmful stereotypes. It's a document that needs to be engaged with critically. But it's undoubtedly a crucial piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding the history of racial inequality in America and the ongoing struggle for justice.
So what does this all mean for us today? We're left with this question. How has our understanding of these issues evolved since 1965? And perhaps even more importantly, what further steps can we take to address the deep-rooted challenges that continue to affect Black communities today? That's something for all of us to think about.